Hello my dear friends! Today we are going to upgrade our factory applied piping tips. I made Italian meringue cream and buttercream glaze. First we'll make some flowers with factory applied tips. These flowers will be terribly awful, yikes! And then we'll take upgraded piping tips and make, wow, wonderful, gorgeous flowers. I took 3 most popular piping tips for flower piping. These are basic tips. The first tip is number 124K. It's a straight, narrow tip. You can make very beautiful straight petals for ranunculuses and roses of different kinds with it. But it comes too narrow from the factory. If you try piping flowers without upgrading this tip, you'll get a wavy ribbon instead of a petal. We'll make it a bit wider. The second piping tip is number 123 and number 122. These piping tips are identical, number 122 being slightly smaller and number 123 being slightly larger. It's a very useful piping tip. You can make peonies of different kinds with it, some round flowers of different kinds, any flowers which resemble peonies. It comes very wide. You see how wide its bottom is. You'll get fat-bottomed peonies with it, so we need to make it narrower. Piping tip number 104. It's a perfect tip for the greenery. More often than not, we make the greenery right on the flowers. And for some types of cream, you can also make greenery on a baking paper, let it dry or freeze, and then put it onto the cake. Piping tip number 104 or 103, a straight tip. We'll make it narrower, because it comes too wide from the factory. Alright. Let's make some flowers with factory-applied tips first, so that we had something to put in comparison. I have 2 piping bags with unrefined piping tips. Ateco piping tip number 123 and piping tip number 104 for the greenery. The tips are not upgraded yet, and I will make some flowers with them now. Let's start with a peony. First we make a base as usual and start making petals. The first thing I'm not comfortable with is this heavy bottom. This part of the petal is too thick. It means my peony will be thick. Even considering my experience, it's difficult for me to pipe. I really lack refinement on the petals. The petals are really thick. It bothers me. We'll make a large peony now. It doesn't look too bad, but the petals are thick. I can't add more petals. I had to cut down the number of petals. Let's take the greenery now. Piping tip number 104. The greenery made with an unrefined tip looks more or less decent. We only need to make the bottom part of this tip a bit narrower. Alright, here's our peony. Now we are going to make a ranunculus with 2 unrefined piping tips. I put piping tip number 124K on the same bag we used before. This tip is too narrow. We'll try to make a ranunculus with it. First we make kind of a tower for the base with piping tip number 104. We are making a tower. Piping tip number 104 has a wide bottom part. You can still work with it, it won't hurt you. But nevertheless, I think you'd better make it narrower. Then you will be able to put more petals. It's especially essential for Italian meringue cream. Now we take piping tip number 124K, unrefined, and we try to pipe petals with it. The first problem we face is that this narrow tip makes our petals curly. They are constantly trying to curve in one or another direction. Right now, we can only see how these small petals curve at the beginning. But it's already a problem, because all these minor defects will be seen on the flower. You can see it well on large petals. They tend to curl. I simply can't make a straight petal, even though I have an experienced hand in piping flowers. Right now, I do my best to get smooth petals. But soon I'll need to put some straight petals on the sides, at the bottom, to make the flower beautiful. And all of them come wavy. I must be able to make such wavy petals on purpose by pressing the piping bag harder. But right now, no matter how I press the bag, I get wavy petals anyway. They look like an accordion, and I need straight petals. I take the greenery bag and make some greenery.
Берем пакет с зеленью, делаем зелень.
Greenery looks okay. Let's put it onto the work surface. Now it's time for the buttercream glaze. We'll also make some flowers with unrefined piping tips. We start with a peony. I have an unrefined tip here. I'm making a peony. I make a base. It's even more noticeable with buttercream glaze. The petals we make with an unrefined tip are way too thick. It's terrible. The petals lack delicacy. Their bottom is too thick. They are very difficult to pipe. It's really difficult. It's a completely different flower. I don't recognize my peony. It's a disaster. I'm not even sure I can make it to the end. It will be lumpish. Just look at it. First of all, I spent a lot of cream on this flower. I could have made 2 flowers with this amount of cream. What's more, the upper part of the tip is very narrow and the bottom part is really wide. It's a disaster, not a peony. I can't say anything good about it. Now let's make the greenery. Well, greenery is fine in both cases. It's not too crucial. But I would still make this number 104 piping tip narrower to be on the safe side. The greenery will be more delicate if we make the tip narrower. Let's put this weirdo on the work surface. Now we'll make a ranunculus with an unrefined piping tip number 124K, which is too narrow. We take piping tip number 104 first and make a base with it. Buttercream glaze is thinner than Italian meringue cream. It is almost transparent, so we can make more petals and give the flower some delicacy. But that's true as long as the piping tips are in optimum working condition. We are making the first petals. On this cream, you can see clearly that the piping tip is too narrow. The petals are curling. Just when they need to be smooth and straight, they are in a whirl and start curling in one or another direction.
Те моменты, когда они должны быть ровными, это особенно важно для ранункулюса, они начинают ходить ходуном и закручиваться в разные стороны.
Sometimes the petals are so thin that they don't hold their shape. They start sticking out.
форму. То есть он начинает
There it is.
вот, видите,
I need to
мне
make
нужно
a
большой
large
лепесток
long
положить,
petal here.
длинный.
So I pressed the bag
Нажала,
harder,
чтобы он
and it curled at once,
удлинился,
corrupting the
стоял
previous
ровно,
petals as well.
и предыдущие
I press the
лепестки
piping bag the way I usually do,
жму
but
я
I
по
keep
привычке,
getting
как
wavy
обычно делаю.
petals instead of straight, smooth petals I wanted to make.
Лепестки, вместо тех, которые
I would be
мне
fine with slightly curved petals, but this is too much.
ну или слегка изогнутых, но не такой степени.
Greenery is fine here as well.
Все хорошо срабатывает.
Let's imagine that we are making greenery on the cake.
Вот наш лист.
Here our leaf goes up, up, up and comes back down.
Обратно.
Up, up, up and back down. This piping tip is okay for the greenery. Not bad at all. It's hard to fold. I would still make it narrower, but it's not crucial.
Нормально, как бы я подзагнула.
Italian meringue cream greenery.
Зелень из белкового.
Our leaf goes up and down.
Наш листик пошел.
I'd like it to be a bit thinner, but like I said, it's not crucial. It's quite a good tip. You can work with it.
Немножко потоньше.
You can make various interesting swirls with it, interesting greenery.
Можно и работать, можно делать всякие завитки интересные зелени.
Let's get down to work.
Нам понадобится
You'll need flat nose pliers, and you can also use a flower nail. Just be careful not to hurt yourself.
если совсем
You can use an awl or a thick nail, but a flower nail would also do.
тоже есть,
You can refine your piping tips with it.
который можно доработать насадки.
Let's start with the narrow tip number 124K.
И начнем
We
с самого
start with the most difficult
сложного.
task.
Расширить.
We need to make this tip wider.
Да, просовывайте
Put the tool inside,
у меня ножка
in this case I have a flower nail,
начинаете раздвигать.
and start slowly widening the slot.
Тяжело делать.
You have to apply some force. It's not so easy to do.
Потом на серединку.
You'll have a hard time once, but then you'll have a good piping
Нужно,
tip.
чтобы вот эта
Then
шина
push hard in the center until the awl or the nail slips through the slot.
Не бойтесь, что она
Don't worry about minor scratches it may leave on the piping tip.
на цветах это
They won't show on the flowers. You need to widen the slot, so you put the awl inside and move it carefully back and forth.
вверх, вниз.
Back and forth, like this. Back and forth.
Сюда.
And now take it out. You see, it's already become wider. It has a small curve in the center.
Стало шире. Вот у меня
It's a great result if you manage to do it at the first try.
сразу так получилось.
Now we need to check the thin edge.
Смотреть.
The slot like this works well on flowers.
Хорошо.
But if you ended up making it wider, better narrow it a little.
То лучше его слегка.
Right now, I will go over it once again. We are trying to level off this white part we got in the center. We should level it off, making a smooth transition from the white part on top to the narrow part at the bottom.
То есть, чтобы мы его
You can put the nail from outside as well.
сторона насадки
Go back and forth carefully to smooth it out.
сверху тоже засуньте.
We should get such an evened out piping tip. To narrow the bottom edge a little, put the piping tip onto the table
подогнуть
Grip it with the
кончик,
pliers
поставить
and
насадку,
squeeze just a little.
прихватываете с краю и совсем чуть-чуть сжимаете.
We ended up with an even, nice, refined piping tip. Try piping a flower with it and check if you still need to give it another brush. Maybe it's not even enough. Maybe it's still too narrow on top. Put the nail inside and go back and forth again, making it a bit wider. If it's too wide at the bottom, squeeze it with the pliers again. If you made it too narrow, take the nail and make it wider again. It's a long repeated process. If you really like bean paste, such dilated edge will work well for you, because bean paste petals tear on the edge. The same may happen to buttercream glaze. To avoid getting ragged edges, make this narrow part a bit wider. Italian meringue cream works better with a narrow edge. Now a no less interesting but easier process. We need to make some piping tips narrower. You take flat nose pliers, grip the piping tip with them and squeeze it. Squeeze it bit by bit. You can't do it in one go, because piping tips are quite solid. Be careful not to hurt yourself. I've already made the bottom part narrower. It looks much nicer. I put the piping tip evenly onto the work surface to narrow the middle part. Grip it with the pliers from above and squeeze it carefully, moving bit by bit from the wide part towards the narrow edge. Make it narrower throughout the length. You can make it a bit wider or narrower, it's up to you. I like narrower piping tips, so I make them quite narrow. To keep it even, squeeze it bit by bit. That's it, the piping tip is ready. The same deal with the edge here. If you like bean paste, leave it as it is. For Italian meringue cream, make it a bit narrower on the edge. Try piping a flower first. If you need to give it another brush, take the piping tip off and go over it once again. Once is enough. You need to make a good piping tip, which you will use happily for the rest of your life. Piping tip number 104. Here we only need to make the bottom part narrower. Simply squeeze the widest part of the tip. If the pliers come off, leaving a roughness, take your awl or nail and smooth it out. Don't worry, it won't show on the flowers. That's it. We made it narrower and smoothed it out a little. The piping tips are done. We have upgraded them and now we can make beautiful, cool flowers with them. We have refined our piping tips. Now let's see what beautiful, splendid flowers we can make with them. Look what a beautiful narrow tip we have now. Let's make a peony with it. You see, the base already looks different. Now we can make more petals in one row. Let's go on. The base of the flower is narrower this time. The bottom of the petal is thinner, and the petal itself is more delicate. I can put petals in one or another direction. The petals themselves are thinner, so I can make more of them. It's especially important for Italian meringue cream, because this cream isn't transparent, and you need to leave some air space between the petals. Now I'm making large petals. They hold on perfectly well. Some repeated petals. They are high and beautiful, and everything stays put.
Высокий, красивый.
I made very airy cream this time.
Очень воздушный крем получился.
A beautiful large peony.
Ну, какой большой, красивый пион. Так, зелень.
Greenery.
И ставим пион.
Let's take the peony off. We are making a ranunculus of Italian meringue cream with a refined piping tip.
Ранункулюс из белкового заварного
We make a
крема с
base.
насадками.
A refined piping tip number 104 is narrower.
Доработанная, она тоньше.
It now has a narrower bottom.
Вверх
You can also refine its upper part if you wish.
лучше. И вот я могу
Now I can make more petals because they are thinner. I made a high base.
и беру доработанную насадку.
Now I take a refined tip number 124K and start making petals.
Они ровненькие.
They are smooth and have proper thickness. They hold the shape well.
Немножко
They still curve a little, but not too much. It's fine.
не страшно.
You can refine the tip a bit more or leave it as it is. You can work perfectly well with it.
Этим можно прекрасно работать.
The key point is that these petals are smooth and beautiful and hold their shape perfectly well.
И хорошо держат.
The most important thing is that they remain upright when we put them onto the flower.
Когда мы
Very beautiful straight petals.
красивые такие вот.
And of course, you can still make some wavy petals if you want.
Мы сами хотим.
You can make a curve with your wrist or simply press the piping bag harder. Now we can control it.
Надавить посильнее на.
Look how beautiful it is.
То есть мы это можем.
Straight petals are quite the thing.
Смотрите, какая красота. Ровно.
Let's make the greenery. The leaves are more delicate now because we are working with a narrower tip.
Делаем лист.
It's also very important because Italian meringue cream is quite thick per se, so we need to add some delicacy by making the petals thinner.
Важно, потому что белковый крем сам по себе плотный, и нам нужно изящество добавлять тонкостью лепестков.
We are making a peony of buttercream glaze with a refined piping tip. Ateco piping tip number 123.
Основание.
We make a base. You see how thin the petals are. They are so pleasant to pipe. It's wonderful. You simply can't do that with an unrefined piping tip.
Недоработанный насадка.
A peony bud.
Тон пион.
You can make some green sepals for it and it will be a perfect bud.
Листники, и будет.
We go on making petals, creating some volume. They are so thin that I can put as many petals as I want.
Я могу кучу лепестков положить, сколько хочу.
Our peony has a high base. Splendid! The petals are so thin. I put petals in all kinds of ways to make the flower wider.
Навешать еще.
You can hang a quantity of petals onto it and it still remains high.
Так, теперь мы
Now let's make some leaves for it. Thin, beautiful leaves.
тоже они такие тоненькие, красивые.
Now we are going to make a ranunculus of buttercream glaze with our refined piping tips. I have very little cream left, but we must make a ranunculus. We make a base with a refined piping tip number 104. The petals are thin, so you can make many of them. Of course, you will only see the upper petals of the ranunculus in the end. But there are some small green buds where the thinness of the piping tip will play a key role. We made a base. Now we move on to petals for our ranunculus. We take our refined piping tip number 124K and start making petals. Look how smooth they are. They are thicker than the petals we made before with an unrefined tip. It may seem that the thinner the petals, the better, but no. Those petals didn't stay put, didn't remain straight. And these petals are completely manageable. They behave the way I want them to behave. They won't get wavy even if I press the bag a bit harder. They are smooth. You can make the petals really long now. We start opening the flower little by little. Even these wavy petals don't curl as much as petals made with an unrefined tip. We make some repeated petals. We can make them towards or away from ourselves. You see, here I pressed the bag harder and ended up with a wavy petal. But I can control that. I'm running out of cream, but we can still finish these petals. Let's add the greenery. Now it's time for the greenery. I start with buttercream glaze. I make some greenery with a refined piping tip.
Настала очередь для зелени. Начинаем с масляного крема глазурь. Доработанной насадкой делаем листву.
The difference is not so obvious with the greenery. It may even happen that the piping tip is too narrow. If you make buttercream glaze leaves with such tip and freeze them, they will be very difficult to take off the baking paper later, because they are too thin. So it won't influence the greenery so much, but it may be significant for some small buds you make with this tip. Now let's make some leaves of Italian meringue cream with a refined piping tip. We make some leaves. It looks beautiful when you put one leaf upon another on the cake. Such rampant greenery. Even though I said that the tip doesn't influence the greenery so much, it's still more pleasant for me to make the greenery with a refined piping tip. It seems more balanced, more convenient to work with. Well, let's compare the results. On the left, I have flowers made with factory-applied piping tips. And on the right, I have flowers made with refined piping tips. Let's start with peonies. Here's the peony made with a factory-applied tip.
Результат.
If you compare it with a refined one, you can see that it has thick petals. Here the petals are thinner, which allowed us to make more petals. Even if I wanted to make some curved petals here, like on this one, I couldn't do it. The white piping tip made the flower base wide very quickly, preventing me from adding smaller petals. We also have less space between the petals here. Space which helps us make Italian meringue cream lighter and figuratively transparent. Anyway, a refined tip looks better and cooler. You can see it with your own eyes. Ranunculuses. I don't even think I have to show you which tip I used to pipe which flower. Factory-applied tip gave us very thin petals. They kept curling, and I failed to make an even circle for the flower. I couldn't make petals upright, make sure they start and finish in an even bow. All of them are uneven. All petals made with a refined tip have the same thickness. I put and stretched them the way I wanted. They didn't curl. So I managed to make a beautiful round ranunculus. And on the whole, it was more convenient to work with this tip. We see the same situation with buttercream glaze. I made two different creams on purpose to show you that refined piping tips work well with any cream. Bean paste, shanty-flax cream, as well as two creams represented here. The thickness of the petals influences the liveliness of the flower and the number of petals you can make. It's especially evident in ranunculuses. Here are our straight petals. They lie beautifully. Everything is balanced. One petal goes after another. There are no extra curls. If curls do appear, they are completely under my control. I put them where I want them. The difference is not so obvious with greenery, but as I said, it's more convenient to work with a refined, narrower tip. Dear friends, if you failed making flowers earlier, there's every likelihood that your tips are to blame, not your hands. Simply refine them and create flowers for pleasure. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button, write your comments, and watch this video with a piping tips review.